And let's turn our attention to the other big story, which we've been speaking about here and hearing about for a number of weeks, the Israeli-run new aid regime, which is going to be manned by mercenaries, and from what I've read, number of ISIS, ex-ISIS members, warlords, and drug dealers who are actually manning some of the areas in Gaza as well. It faces first big hurdle this week. The head of the plan, his name is, I think, Jake Wood. He resigned, saying that the operation could not fulfill its mission in a way that adhered to humanitarian principles. And what we've learned over the past week is that the funding of this new aid regime, which bypasses the UN and all other aid organization, is unclear. The UN has opposed it, saying that it goes against international law and a number of other reasons it's cited. So we are, as I said, we are recording on Tuesday, and this story is unfolding. There's a number of events on the ground that's happened today, Tuesday, the 27th of May. So do you want to go through that, Moin? And keeping in mind, as I said, that it's an unfolding story regarding the new humanitarian, so-called humanitarian aid regime that's been installed by Israel.
Yes, as you mentioned, we're speaking on Tuesday, and I suspect that by the time this video airs, this entire effort will no longer exist, and I'll explain why. As you mentioned, Israel, in collusion with the United States, concocted this fraudulent scheme with the Orwellian name of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Apparently, this initiative has been over a year in the making, and what the Israelis and Americans decided, primarily the Israelis, of course, is that they could hit two birds with one stone. The first being to eliminate the role of international aid agencies in the Gaza Strip, and thinking primarily, of course, of UNRWA, the UN Refugee Agency for Palestine refugees, but also all the others we've been hearing about during the past several years, World Central Kitchen, Norwegian Refugee Council, and all the rest of them, basically to sideline them and replace them with with a quote unquote aid mechanism that is in fact an appendage of not only the Israeli military, but also an appendage of Israel's strategy towards the Gaza Strip. And what this Orwellian named Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was supposed to do was to set up a limited number of distribution centers in the south of the Gaza Strip so that any Palestinian, and bear in mind, since March 2nd, not a grain of wheat, not a loaf of bread, not a drop of fuel, not a drop of water has entered the Gaza Strip, absolutely no medicine or whatever. And any Palestinian who was sufficiently desperate to acquire these essential supplies needed for sustenance and survival would have to make the trek to the southern Gaza Strip, go through a number of Israeli checkpoints where, of course, all their information would be taken and they could be kidnapped or held hostage at will, then receive a package of basic supplies that would last 1 week, return to wherever they wanted to take those, and then have to repeat the exercise on a weekly basis. And the idea was basically to create a series of concentration camps, as they were more or less explicitly called by those responsible for the scheme, as a prelude to pushing the entire population out of the Gaza Strip. Um, Now, when you have exorbitantly paid mercenaries resigning and resigning sanctimoniously citing humanitarian principles, which clearly they never gave a hoot about, then you know you're in trouble. And what happened is this past week, the scheme's executive director, who was essentially appointed by the Israeli military, an American mercenary, and I think a former sniper, so someone, who probably has quite a lot of blood on his hands even before he started. I think his name is Jake Wood. Um, Resigned, claiming, that he suddenly came to the realization that this entire scheme violated every elementary principle of humanitarian aid, whether neutrality, whether the idea of, taking supplies to the desperate population rather than making them walk for kilometers to get it. And of course, many people are simply incapable of doing so. But nevertheless, after additional delays, presumably to make the desperate population even more desperate, this Orwellian named Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, whose purpose is to restrict rather than provide aid, established one of its first distribution centers in Rafah, in the extreme south of the Gaza Strip. According to reports from, again, Tuesday morning, just before we began our discussion, it was complete pandemonium. These people have no idea what they're doing. Their experience is in being mercenaries rather than humanitarian workers. And what happened is they had insufficient supplies. Um, Large crowds of desperate Palestinian civilians surged into this center to seek to acquire anything they could. Um, and the result was such pandemonium that even these heavily armed US mercenaries recruited by the genocidal apartheid state ended up fleeing the distribution center and had to do so under covering fire from Israeli snipers and US supplied Israeli helicopter gunships. There are additional reports that as these civilians were making their way by foot to the distribution center, that they had to provide all kinds of biometric and other information, that a number of them were kidnapped and are now being kept hostage by the Israeli military, and will presumably be put into its torture system. And just one last point, which you raised about ISIS. Yes, there have been persistent reports of two related issues. On the one hand, Israel has been systematically targeting any remnants of the government in Gaza on the pretext that these are Hamas, and any remnants of the police force that was seeking to secure aid and its distribution. At the same time, it was also collaborating with certain militias in the Southern Gaza Strip, whose leaders are known to be aligned in one way or another with ISIS, arming them and basically ensuring that it was they who would loot all the aid that would come in. And of course, the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra turns around and says, well, all this was necessary to ensure that Hamas would stop looting aid. Well,
Mm.
all the available evidence shows that there is no need to stop Hamas from looting aid, because Hamas has not been looting aid. In fact, Hamas has been working, or the government rather, has been working to secure aid. And the most recent evidence we have in this respect is that of Cindy McCain, the executive director of the World Food Program, if I'm not mistaken. The daughter of easily one of the top five most pro-Israeli figures in U.S. history, John McCain. And she was asked on one of the Sunday news shows in the U.S., Face the Nation, I believe, whether there is any evidence that Hamas has been looting aid. And she answered that with, I think, two words: no and never.
And it was quite clear from the beginning, I think, that the motivation for this is not humanitarian. It is really another continuation of the use of starvation and famine as a weapon of war. And the goal is to move Palestinians or entice Palestinians from the north to the south and put them into the concentration camps, which we've discussed in previous shows, and ultimately with the end game of forcing Palestinians out. That seems to be the overriding
Yes.
motivation here. It is nothing to do with
Yeah.
providing humanitarian aid or the 3 million or so meals that this so-called aid organization is going to be distributing. It's got
Well,
nothing to do with that.
if I can paraphrase von Clausewitz, for Israel, starvation is a continuation of war by other means. I mean, it's absolutely transparent, and the reason it's absolutely transparent is that the Israeli leadership, those who are responsible for this policy, have been telling us black on white. But of course, Israel's apologists and flunkies claim that none of this is happening, even as Israel's leadership is telling us not only this is exactly what's happening, but this is happening because this is what they are seeking, um, uh, what they are seeking to achieve. It's really, beyond words. If Israel's apologists and flunkies are to be believed, yes, there is a comprehensive siege on the Gaza Strip. The only people suffering from this are, of course, armed Hamas combatants. But the civilian population, according to them, has never had it better. It's just, getting back to the point you made in the introduction, it's a hard sell. Granted, Israel's messengers are increasingly low quality. Israel really is scraping the bottom of the barrel. But you could get the best public relations firms on earth, and they wouldn't be able to convincingly sell, the message that burning children alive, that starving an entire population is actually a good thing we should support.